So, Kathrin, sex, power, shadow, what does this evoke for you?
It evokes a lot of different thoughts on different levels. I mean, it's a very topical theme, what with all the sexual harassment stuff that's going on. And I guess when I hear about mostly men in power abusing their position in order to get some kind of sexual gratification, as a woman, I think, I wonder what's happening for those women.
Yeah.
There may be some who are just basically blackmailed, so it may be purely a matter of power. But what I find more interesting is the point where actually for women power is sexy, and so that's where the idea of shadow comes in. It's like the abuse of power is the shadow side of the fact that actually for many women power is sexually attractive, and it's a good part of a sexual relationship is that you feel you're having a relationship with a partner who is powerful.
Yeah. So we're not going into, power is bad, but actually saying, power can be sexy, and here what we're talking about is not power per se, but the shadow of power, the abuse of power.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I'm the last person to say that power is bad. I think I'm a body psychotherapist, and I do think that body psychotherapy has a particular concept of power, which is very much a personal, embodied power that isn't the power over others, but it's just the power to be myself as fully as I can. And I would see that on the whole as a very positive thing. And then I guess we would see the power over others, the power that makes us able to make others do things, or use others to gratify our needs and all the rest of it. I would see that as a neurotic, mainly narcissistic distortion. Which does a lot of evil in the world, basically.
Yeah. So as therapists, we do our best to empower people, and that's finding that personal power, and make a big distinction between that and people who try to have power over others.
That's right. And this power over others can either be personal, i.e. at the extreme end from somebody who bullies or somehow coerces others or blackmails others, or it can be more institutional, where you have a position that gives you power, which I think is probably also relevant for therapists, because of course being a therapist is a kind of power. And even though there are, particularly amongst the humanistic therapists, there are many who would like to not know about this. So they avoid the particular shadow of the power that I, as therapist, have over my clients.
Yeah. So we are in a position of power as well, and we ignore it with consequences when we do.
That's right. Yeah. And I guess, I don't know, the way I've been taught and what I've learned since is the way to be with that power is not to avoid it, but to use it with all the responsibility that I can, and try to be relational, really, to always ask, how is this for the other person? What's happening for the other person? What might this mean for the other person?
So are you talking here as a therapist or in general? Because I could see it coming both ways.
Yes, I think it's applicable in any way, yeah. I think if you like power, certainly power that's down to a position we have or personal power, but in a way it's a privilege, and I think privileges always come with obligations. Mm-hmm. And the obligation is to be concerned for those in our power.
Yeah. So that's in a view that's very relational. We have power. It's part of the relationship. We have responsibility. It's also part of the relationship. And a sense of self, accountability, responsibility in terms of recognizing, this relationality.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I think a lot of therapeutic relationships can get broken because the therapist just didn't realize what was happening for the client, and the client somehow didn't feel able to communicate that. And in therapy, in an ideal world, it would be possible to eventually communicate it. In the real world, it's much harder to do that. So.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if maybe one possible way we can, continue from this is to say, this wave of sexual harassment revelations points to the abuses of power, the difference between, personal power and abuse of power. And as therapists, it probably behooves us to actually use this as an incentive to pay attention to it in terms of how we behave as therapists vis-a-vis our clients. What are the ways in which we might not be as aware of our power? Are there ways, including embodied ways, that we can pay attention to the presence and the play of power, as it plays out in the therapeutic relationship?
Yes. I guess it's, I can see one difficulty with that, which is certainly if we look at the sexual harassment claims, these are very much made by an underprivileged group against the ruling powerful group. And you'd have to, if you look at that from outside, you think, well, it's not surprising that men don't do anything about this because they're the ones in power. It's the ones who don't have the power who actually have to initiate the change. I think in the therapeutic setting, this might not be quite like that. So it might be slightly different, and undoubtedly it also makes a difference that clients are more willing, and psychotherapy trainees are more willing these days to point out these dynamics and to protest when they feel treated as in any way less than human. But I guess there are some very obvious things. So I was trained by largely men who mostly were quite tall and physically quite powerful, and at the time we were still taught quite a lot of sort of high energy techniques where you really use your own body to meet the client's body in sometimes quite forceful ways. And although this was all modified, and we always said, well, if you're smaller than your client, you have to modify this as you have to. But I've often wondered since, I wonder what it's like to be in the world where actually most people are smaller than you, and actually you can sort of invite a lot of stuff to come at you and not have to be afraid. Because when you're a woman, the world's just not like that. It's completely different. Mostly you're afraid of other people because you can't be sure that you'll be strong enough to actually really meet the challenge. Apart from also being trained not to go for confrontation physically. So that's a really obvious way where you can say, actually the world is different for men and for people who are quite big and hefty. And it might be interesting to see if we can factor that in somehow.
But so that's a very powerful point, because it has to do, certainly one of the things you mentioned has to do with the differences between men and women, in terms of size, weight, but also psychological, sociological training of gender role. But it has also to do with being a tall, powerful person versus somebody who is, smaller or less hefty. It might also, have to do with age. somebody
Indeed.
who is young is going to have more stamina than somebody who's not.
That's
It
right.
has to do with life history, somebody who's had a trauma or had difficulty. So there's a lot of questions of meaning. And
Yeah.
I wouldn't, without discounting in any way what you're saying about men versus women in this situation, I would say there's also something about simply that assumption from the people in authority, in this case the male therapists who were training you, that their viewpoint, their perspective is the only one in the world, and not counting that other people can actually see the same situation in a totally different way based on who they are and their experience.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. I agree with that. And of course we all do this. Yeah. We all have a bias which is based on our own body and based on our own experience. So yeah. And I guess, for me it would mean, for instance, that I would value the power of having a lot of knowledge of the world and a certain wisdom and some intelligence higher than just being athletic and physically gung-ho and willing to engage on having big fights with my clients. For somebody else that might be different.
Yeah, yeah. So we're talking about value systems that, again, we evolve based on who we are physically, emotionally, life history, and how we can be blind to other people's values, even with the best of intentions.
Yes. I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think where therapists are perhaps at risk is where they take their own good intentions for granted. And I think that's often the point where I think, I'm trying to help this client, and I can't see that actually for this particular client in this particular situation, this isn't at all helpful.
Yeah. So again, here a big difference, in the cases of sexual abuse we talked about, there is no real benevolent intentions. In this case,
yes.
in our case as therapists, there is a benevolent intentions. We take it for granted that we are good people trying to help clients.
That's right. Yeah.
But so how do we notice that? How do we, it's very difficult. This is a blind spot. So in the best cases, how do we become aware of it?
I wish I knew. It's a very simple answer. I don't have simple answers. I mean, being very observant to and keep seeking the feedback from the client. I think it's probably a good rule of thumb never to take it granted that what we're doing is actually helpful for a client. But there might be other warning signs. I know one colleague who has done a lot of ethical complaints, and who says the one thing that's common to all people who commit boundary transgressions is that they'll all say, "Oh, but this is different." So maybe when you catch yourself thinking, "Oh, but I'm different," maybe that's when you're most at risk. That would be a slightly paradoxical answer.
Yeah. So one thing is to be aware of it and to constantly check for it, to maintain that sense of attunement, communication, feedback. And the other big danger signal is, "Oh, but I'm different."
I think so. Yeah, when you when the part of you might know that what you're doing isn't quite okay, and you find yourself trying to persuade yourself that it is okay, really. But it does presuppose a high degree of self-awareness. An openness to the shame of realizing that, shit, what I'm doing here isn't okay.
So that might be a good segue into the notion of shame. Power, shadow, shame.
Yeah. It must be one of the shadows of power. Yeah. What shall I say about shame? In a situation of abuse, much of the shame that should be the abuser's shame passes on to the victim usually. That seems to be a very typical pattern. I think it's unfortunately also typical for victims who seek to do something about their situation to try and give the shame back to the abuser by shaming, as is happening now, yeah, by shaming abusers. I mean, collectively there may be some use in this, as it probably is at the moment. For an individual, I doubt that that's very useful, and I mean neither for the victim nor for the perpetrator. To take revenge in that sense is usually actually not a thing that makes anything better. And I would assume that most people in positions of power who abuse that power would be very defended against shame. That's sort of part of the presentation.
Yeah. So just shame by itself is not really achieving its ends, because the perpetrator is actually somebody who has a thick armor against that.
Yes, and yes, that, I mean, it. You know, you can publicly humiliate somebody, but whether they will actually feel shame, that goes somewhere. Yeah, they may feel shame that to them feels abusive again, so they may end up feeling abused. And because I think it takes a considerable degree of psychological maturity to be able to feel shamed and to be able to process that and say, actually, yeah, what I done wasn't okay, and this is what I'm going to do about it. That seems to be quite a rare thing these days.
So what we're talking about here is shame in interpersonal relations. Like the victim trying to get something from the perpetrator in terms of eliciting shame is not really a good strategy. And we're talking about that as opposed to, say, the public outcry, which then has an impact on the employer or authorities, and then has a way of controlling the abuser, the perpetrator.
Yes, that's right. So the social zeitgeist, if you like, will change through the massive public shaming of people, as is happening now, so that it becomes unacceptable, basically, to behave in a certain way, whereas until now it has been changed. I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know how helpful it is for the zeitgeist to also forget that people still need to have a relationship with power. The solution isn't going to be that nobody is allowed any power, or people in power need to be very tightly regulated or very tightly bound by rules. That probably isn't a very creative way for the whole thing to go.
Yeah, so we're coming back to the sense that power by itself is not necessarily bad. And actually, by trying to be too rigid about it, we actually miss out on something that in the long run is a more productive area, which is to help people having a more productive relationship with power.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that's a good psychotherapeutic aim, yeah. Not very many people will come to therapy and say, I want a different relationship with my own power. But often that is what they mean, and often that is what needs to happen.
So let's talk a little bit about that. How people, maybe expectation of having a different relationship with power, what they might expect at the outset, and what happens with, that we try to do.
That's a very big field.
I mean, I'm give you what it evokes for me, just maybe as a starting point, is somebody who comes in and says, I'm very angry. I'm an angry person, and I shouldn't be. And actually to tell people how anger is good, and it's a question of taming the horse as opposed to killing the horse.
Yes. So that would be a very good description. Or somebody who comes in who says they're very timid or they never get anywhere in life. And how can we give them a bit more of a sense of their own power. I think there are always two ways of working, and generally I tend to go backwards and forwards between them depending on where there is some mileage. One would be to look at what gets in the way, look at all the things that stop the person from being powerful, which are usually good reasons, and generally are the processes that are not entirely in the past but are actually still going on in the present. So you could call that resistance in the most general sense, but they're generally active processes like, if I become powerful, nobody will support me, I'll be lonely, I'll be on my own. Yeah, these are sort of very typical fears that people have of being powerful. Or if I'm powerful, I become dangerous. Or if I'm powerful, I will, create terribly bad relationships. And then on the other hand, you can also work to put the deeper dynamic and say, okay, so if you're in a position where you want a particular goal, how do you go about it in a slightly more grown-up way? Yeah, where you can just be quite matter of fact about how do you get what you want in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so enlisting actually, even that question is a way to already reach the person at a level of having some power.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
You connect with the empowered side of that person.
You have to do that at some point, yes. Yeah. Sometimes you have to reach very deep, or really find a tiny little spark of power in the person, but and then nurture that, and this can take a very long time. But if somebody has survived to the age where they present for therapy, there's probably some power there somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes it also includes undoing the kind of narcissistic belief in power, meaning power over and control over other people, and just finding ways of getting from others what you want without any kind of regard to who the other person is. Especially if you work very much with very young states of the person, because they're usually the states they're usually the ages of development where people really don't know about others, and where people are, or very small children are really not capable of seeing other people as people. Then sometimes you have to help the person, or hope that the person makes that transition somehow.
Yeah, so we're talking about very paying attention to where the sense of power is in that person.
Yes.
The assumption that if they've come to see us, they've grown to a certain age, it requires some degree of power, and so building from that. And as you talk about this, I'm drawn to something we talked earlier in the conversation, and you were talking about your own training in somatic psychotherapy, and those trainers who were essentially athletic men and not necessarily connected to, say, a woman trainee. And so the experience as a woman trainee in that context was probably something where you were more aware of your lack of power relative to those men. I'm just wondering how you connected to your own power and your way of expressing power, in that setting.
Right. For a start, I have to say that I think I went to a very good training school. I think the trainers were considerate people, and people who were open to seeing other points of view, and open to having a sense of diversity and a sense of how others are different and have different viewpoints. So it wasn't impossible to have the conversation. At the time, mostly I assumed that I didn't feel very powerful because I was a trainee. I was in my 30s, and I had, up to that point, I had been a research scientist and quite powerful in that position. And suddenly I was a trainee and I was at the bottom of the pile, and that in itself was quite a shocking experience. And so I took it in my stride that that was just how it was going to be. And I think later I gained a lot of the sense of my own power just from a lot of female colleagues. And of course, it is typical for the profession that, I don't know, 80 or 90% of practitioners are women, even if when we're looking at who's represented in public, they're mostly men. So there's a very weird gender problem in the profession. But nevertheless, there are a lot of very supportive, very powerful women in the profession who are very good therapists. And I've sort of grown with them and on them and supported by them and held by them. And I would say that that's what's allowed me to become the practitioner that I am. Yeah. And just also the sense that the community where I live and work, I seem to have a good reputation. People send me clients.
Yeah.
So I must be getting something right.
But so what I'm hearing is that to get power, it's not just something that we do individually inside of our mind, but there's something about the context.
Yes.
For all its limitations, the school you went to was one where people were open to diversity, were open to listening, to feedback. Then you point out the very strong role that having other women, strong women who had power in the profession, helped you.
Yeah.
So that sense of, we're tremendously helped, to gain power from a sense of other figures that inspire us or help us.
That's right. Yeah, I would say for me that's been crucial. Yeah. So in that sense, the acquiring of one's own power is absolutely a social process and not just an individual.
Yeah. So the acquiring, you said something I want to repeat. The acquiring of power is a social process.
Yes.
So that's the opposite of isolation.
Yes. The acquiring power and the growing into one's power is a social process. Even though I am not now talking about the purely socially constructed, like institutional power, which we would on the whole call slightly neurotic in body psychotherapy. But we are talking about fully embodied, owned power, but also that is actually dependent on the social environment. It doesn't really exist in isolation.
Yeah. So this sounds like a good place to end. Is this okay with you, or do you have something else to add?
Absolutely fine. Yeah.
Great.